when the Frierdiker passed away, he didn't have any rest. The door kept on opening until by default the Rebbe had to organize meetings, yechidus. It was like one of the first organized components of the Rebbe's Hanesius was that at the end of the summer of Tafshin Yud, they organized yechidus. During the winter and spring and summer of 1950, Tafshin Yud, Chassidim were trying to figure out ways of seat with the Rebbe should become Rebbe. As time passed, the Rebbe became more comfortable with the idea, and the idea became more tenable. But as I told you last time I talked to you, the Rebbe was a man who people knew is very principled and very stubborn. When the Rebbe said no, you knew that in most cases he's not changing his mind. He's not going to go tomorrow and say yes. The Rebbe's Chayamushka, the Rebbe's wife said, my husband, you can only tell something once and you can only suggest it. Once you suggest it and he makes a decision, don't even bring it up again. She was married to him and she knew this. And she said, when you have to tell the Rebbe to do something for his health or something of that sort, you have to be very careful when you choose the moment and how you say it, because you get one shot. And if he decides no, you can hit the wall. And the Rebbe had said no many times to the idea of being a Rebbe. And to reverse that, that's really what happened. The story of Yud Shvat, the Yom Tov of Yud Shvat, the celebration of Yud Shvat, is literally Chassidim changing the Rebbe's mind. And that was a gigantic deal. A gigantic deal. It was a ness. Because the Rebbe was not a man whose mind was easily changed. So months passed, the Rebbe's fabrenging, the Rebbe's writing letters, and people are coming to the Rebbe. And of course, all this time, it's unofficial. So one of the subtexts of this story is what was called then, and I guess it's still called now, the young people. They were the Alte Chassidim, who learned in Lubavitch, the Tmimim. The Rebbe held them to a very high standard. The Rebbe expected from them a certain conduct, which I think many people disappointed him. It's not only expected to be very frum and very chassidish. The Rebbe expected them to be very dedicated, very given over, and they really had a hard time with that. And it was really them who the Rebbe all the time hesitated. My grandfather's name was Shusterman, Mordechai Shusterman, Zaidi Shusterman, we called him affectionately. I married into the family. But I was close to him. He was a nice man, so I was close to him. I talked to him a lot, but I didn't have an intimate relationship with him. But I knew him and I talked to him. And he said to me, he was a Zlobener, city of Zloben. My wife, her father was a Nemenov, Nissen Nemenov, was called Nissen Zlobener. Her mother was a Shusterman, and Shusterman was Mordechai Zlobener. In other words, my wife's parents both are descendants of Zlobener Chassidim. Zloben. The Zlobener Rav was a Yid by the name of Rabbi ben Yominson. There's a head of Tzivas Hashem ben Yominson, this is his Zayde. Rabbi ben Yominson was the Zlobener Rav, he lived in Montreal. He was an old man, he was a big chassid and a big Rav. There's actually pictures of him sitting at a Fabrengen behind the Rebbe. He came to New York. He took 10 chevre, as my lady said, 2 taxis, they called the car a taxi, because nobody owned the car. But the Vega for Nafanayel went to the oil, and they wrote a pigeon. The content of the pigeon was asking the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Rebbe should be Makabel the Hanesius. And when my Zaidi would tell the story, my Zaidi was not a very emotional man, he wasn't a very passionate, he wasn't a very extreme radical man, but when he would tell the story, he would say, you read the letter, the pigeon today, it's as fresh as the day it was written. In other words, the way that Rechmiel ben Yominson wrote that pigeon was so sensitive and so holy and so connected that 30, 40 years after the Rebbe became Rebbe, it still makes sense. He should have written the letter this way. And he wrote it many drafts. He wrote a draft and then he corrected, wrote a second draft. My Zaidi was a smart man. He grabbed one of the drafts. And in his biography, my grandfather's biography, there's a picture of that draft which he saved. The final draft they read by the oil and they tore it up and they left it there. So this year, the Rechmiel ben Yominson came special from Montreal to go with Chassidim to the oil, to Poel Bam Rebbe, Nishma Makabel the Hanesius. And then he went into the Rebbe, and he told the Rebbe straight, he says, Melo uns alte, us old people, maybe learn to Lubavitch, we'll figure it out. But it's right after the war. Was wird sein mit the Junge? What's going to be with the young? And the Rebbe said to him, Rabbi Chmiel ben Yominson said to the Rebbe, so the Rebbe said to him, von der Junge habe ich sich keinmal nicht abgesagt. I never told the young no. And that was true. The young Chassidim, that means the Bacharim, and even the younger light, anybody who intended for the Rebbe to be their Rebbe, that role started way before the year after, the Yud Shvat after. There's a story which I heard, there was a Yid, one of the people, Rabbi Mentlik, Mordechai Mentlik, he wasn't that young. When the Rebbe became Rebbe Mentlik was probably around 40, he got married late, he never had children. But Rabbi Mentlik became the Rebbe's chassid the day the Frierdiker passed away, right away. So Rabbi Yael Khan, who had just arrived, knew that Rabbi Mentlik was both a very serious man and a very intelligent man. So he said to Rabbi Mentlik, how are you so sure? The Frierdiker died, passed away a week ago. How are you sure he's the next Rebbe? So Rabbi Mentlik said to Rabbi Yael, if you would have seen how the Frierdiker Rebbe used to look at him, you would have no doubts. If you had just seen how the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Frierdiker would just look at the Rebbe, the adulation, when the Frierdiker Rebbe would look at the Rebbe, he would beam with joy and pride that he had this as a son-in-law. His whole joy was in our Rebbe. So Rabbi Mentlik told him, if you had seen how the previous Rebbe looked at this Rebbe, you would have no questions that this is the next Rebbe. And there are many stories of Bacharim went into Yechidus and the Rebbe would be makabel them. So the story I wanted to tell was a green glass, yeah? The Rebbe had a special connection to the Bacharim in Montreal. B'chlal, the yeshiva was not the Rebbe's department. The yeshiva was the Rashag's department. But the yeshiva in Montreal, the Polisher, the Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe that this is his achrayas. So a special connection to them. So they came into New York for a meeting. He had come for a meeting. And the Rebbe told them in the meeting, this is before Yud Shvat. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe had passed away. The Rebbe was not yet officially Rebbe. They all had a pretty good idea that this was going to be the next Rebbe, but not all of them were on the same page as far as that was concerned. And the Rebbe said, listen, you're going back to Montreal, there's work to be done, I need to know what's going on. I need every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, one of you has to write me a letter telling me everything that's going on in the work that you're doing. And nobody said a word. Nobody offered. Rabbi Gringlas, Olav Shalom, was thinking to himself, I'll do it. But if I'm doing it, I'm writing Kvei Kedushat Moshlita. Rabbi Gringlas also was one of those people who became the Rebbe's chassid the day the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. He was mamish a buddy of the Rebbe's. The Rebbe was like a friend to him. The Rebbe loved him. He was a holy Jew. He was a pure Jew with an incredible Yedi and Halacha. And the Rebbe had a very personal relationship with Rabbi Gringlas from before. Rabbi Gringlas was one of those Jews, like I told you last time, that he wouldn't shake the Rebbe's hand, and the Rebbe called him an action. So Rabbi Gringlas was thinking, I'll write a letter, but if I'm writing a letter, I'm writing on top Kvei Kedushat Moshlita, and he knew that many of his friends would get very upset about it. So the Rebbe is sitting at his desk, they're all standing in the Rebbe's room, and the Rebbe says to the 9 of them, I need to know what's going on in Montreal. Someone has to write for all of you. No one says a word. Rabbi Gringlas is thinking, I would write the letter, but if I write the letter, I have to write Kvei Kedushat Moshlita. And the Rebbe says, it really doesn't matter how you address me. Just start with Shalom Abracha. The Rebbe responded to his thought. It doesn't matter how. You can start with hello. Don't even say, just start with Shalom Abracha. I just need the information. So that was the kind of thing that was going on that time. There was a Yid's name, this happened during the winter, his name was Moshe Levita, Moshe Kabelakir, Moshe Levita. We have descendants in this room. He came here in Cheshvan, Tafshin Yud Aleph, after the Rosh Hashanah. His brother, I think, came before, but I may be wrong. He walked into the Rebbe. It was before the Rebbe was officially Rebbe. The Rebbe was still wearing a short jacket. The Rebbe saw him, the Rebbe knew him, I don't know how, and the Rebbe very happily got out of his seat and said, Shalom Aleichem. The Rebbe was a nice man. You see a new bacher. He said, Shalom Aleichem. And he stood there with his hands down, like, I'm not shaking your hand. I'm the Rebbe. And as soon as the Moshe Kabbalah, Moshe Levita put his hands down, indicating to the Rebbe that as far as he is concerned, the Rebbe is the Rebbe, the Rebbe became very serious. He put on his gartel, and he sat down in a different place, and he took him to Yechidus right away. In other words, before it was official. Any of the young who saw the Rebbe as the Rebbe treated them in kind. That's really how it was. Now, Rosh Hashanah, they had minyanim. And B'chlal Shabbos was a problem. Why? Every day of the week, the Rashag had his minyan, and the Rebbe had the second minyan. Shabbos, they davened together, and they said Kadeshim in the same minyan. And the Shaila was who should get maftir. So Rabbi Shmuel took maftir. Rabbi Shmuel Levitin took maftir. I heard that he said later, or somebody understood from what he said, Rabbi Shmuel said, I took maftir that year because if I hadn't taken maftir, they would have taken turns. The Rashag and the Rebbe would have taken turns. If they had taken turns, then after the Rebbe would become Rebbe, they would continue taking turns. And the Rashag said the Rebbe has to get maftir. So I was prepared to take maftir for that year, so that when the time came, the Rebbe would get maftir. He wouldn't have to split it with the Rashag. Beryl Rivkin was the Baltakeya, the one who blew shofar, the Frierdiker blew shofar. That's how it was that year. Tishrei time, things began to change. The Rebbe became much more formal. Tishrei time, things became much more formal. There were sort of rules set about how to approach the Rebbe, and the Rebbe became a little bit more distant, still very, very, very warm. And Mechlal, the first 10 years of the Rebbe's Hanesius, the Rebbe acted like a father. I have an aunt, my father's older sister. She talks about the Rebbe like a sports fan adoring an athlete. There was so much promise. They were young, the Rebbe was so youthful, and in the Rebbe they saw anything is possible. The Rebbe made them feel like he can do anything. And they were so on board, they were so with him. They really were so with him. There was a chassid by the name of Moshe Leib Rothstein. He wrote to one of his friends, "They ziehen sich zu ihm wie Fliegen." The young are drawn to the Rebbe like flies. The young American chassidim just loved him. He was so lovable. He was so easy to be around. And the Rebbe responded in kind to the younger. It was to the elder that the Rebbe was more hesitant, reticent, ambivalent, maybe even. Anyway, Simchas Torah, there was a lot of fabrengen. They fabrengen a lot. Simchas Torah, the Rebbe spoke a sicha. One of the things the Rebbe said is you should really go out into the street and grab a guy by the collar and shake him and tell him that there's something called chassidus and that he has to learn it because it'll change his whole life. And the Rebbe said, but you can't exactly beat people up. You have to find a diplomatic way. I said, I think in that fabrengen, the Rebbe said, go to the shuls and tell people that there is a Rebbe, meaning the Frierdiker Rebbe, and that they should follow in the ways of the Rebbe and so forth. Simchas Torah, the Rebbe made an announcement. And this announcement was important because it was an official step. The Rebbe said people are anticipating change, people are expecting things to happen, so I want to make a proposal. The proposal is that between Simchas Torah and Yudas Kislev, which is about 7 weeks, everybody should have their own personal minyan. Every chassid should have 10 people that they were mashpia on for an increase in Yiddishkeit. Either in machshava, they should think differently, or in dibur, or in speech, they should speak differently, or in ma'aseh, they should act differently, or in all three. And the Rebbe said, I'm expecting you to deliver to me your minyan Yudas Kislev. And the Rebbe was talking to chassidim, and it was understood that this was really the Rebbe's way of testing. Are we in? You want him to be Rebbe, then you have to be his chassidim. And he was asking that every chassid should deliver 10 chassidim between Simchas Torah and Yudas Kislev and report back to the Rebbe. I heard from people, although I don't know it for a fact, that the Rebbe had his own minyan. The Rebbe also took 10 Yidden. I remember David Raskin, all of Shalom, he was a very big chassid. Fabrengen went to 770 and he told us a story that when the Rebbe asked for a minyan, he went to look for 10 Jews. There were a lot of Jews around, but not a lot of from Jews around. And he begged them to do one more mitzvah so he should be able to deliver a minyan to the Rebbe. One of the people he went to was a barber on Utica Avenue. Utica Avenue used to be a very Jewish street. And he was begging this barber to close on Shabbos, and the barber refused. He says, I make most of my money on Shabbos. So finally, in desperation, he said to him, I need you to close on Shabbos because I need you for my minyan. Everybody had to deliver to the Rebbe a minyan. And like I said, I understand that the Rebbe himself chose a minyan. When Yudas Kislev came, the Rebbe was very disappointed. The number of people who delivered the minyan, or who even tried to deliver minyan, was very disappointing. People were not fully used to this idea that with this new Rebbe, you're going to have to work very hard. It took a long time for them to figure that out. So the Rebbe spoke about Yudas Kislev. He didn't emphasize his disappointment, but the Rebbe said, okay, you have an extension till Yud Shvat, but by Yud Shvat, everyone has to deliver a minyan. And I believe that by the time Yud Shvat came, many, many more Hasidim appreciated that this is serious, and they delivered, if not a minyan, so some people that they had mashpia on to improve in Yiddishkeit. And I think it wasn't only in New York, I think it was also in other places and overseas, wherever the Sikhs reached. And by the way, I forgot a story, I want to go back to it. I think it was Simchas Torah. Before the Rebbe was Rebbe, he used to get shishi. Every time, if a kid said he got shishi, the Rasha got shlishi, the Rebbe got shishi, and if it was Yom Tov, he got chamishi. When they would call up the Rebbe, they would say Yamoid, they would say the Rebbe's name, first name, second name, and the Rebbe of Levi Yitzchak, shishi. When the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, the Rebbe continued getting shishi, and he would say Yamoid, Harav, the Rebbe's name, shishi. Simchas Torah Tovshin Rav, Simchas Torah in 1951, I think Kazanowski, no, Yechanan maybe, decided that they're going to call the Rebbe up as Adeineinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu. It was before Yud They're going to call it up as Adeineinu V'Rabbeinu. And Adeineinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu, B'chlal, I mean, you guys can't remember this, but when they called the Rebbe to Aliyah, they would say, Yamoid Adeineinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu Ben Harav Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. They wouldn't even say the Rebbe's name. Yamoid Adeineinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu Ben Yitzchak. So the Rebbe stood, and they announced Adeineinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu. They called up to Aliyah Adeineinu V'Rabbeinu. Simchas Torah, the minig was that the Rebbe, I told this to you in the beginning of the year, the Rebbe got Aliyah to have the Frierdiker Rebbe, and they would say Adeineinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu, and they would actually say the Rebbe's name. The first time the Rebbe was called up with the title Adeineinu, I think it was Simchas Torah Yudalf, was before Yud Shvat. The Rebbe showed nothing on his face. You didn't see any emotion. But he went to the Aliyah. He didn't say, I don't know what that is. He went to the Aliyah. They called him up as Adeineinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu Ben Yitzchak. And from that time on, when the Rebbe get an Aliyah, even though it was before Yud Shvat, before the official announcement or establishment of his Nesius, they were addressing him as Adeineinu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu Ben Yitzchak, and he would respond to that. One of the interesting things that occurred that winter is that the Rebbe wrote a letter, El Kol Hu Admoirim Shlita. The Rebbe wrote a letter to all the Rebbes in the world. There were so many Rebbes in those days, because there were so many gezets, so many dynasties. And in the letter which the Rebbe wrote, Al Kol Admoirim Shlita, the Rebbe asks that every Chassidish Rebbe should get together on Yotes Kislev and make a Fabrengen. That they should all celebrate the Moed of Yotes Kislev. Before he was officially Rebbe, he only did that one time. He never did it again. In Tafshin Yud, before he was officially Rebbe, the Rebbe wrote a letter, L'chol ho admoirim shlita, that Yotes Kislev, which is Rosh Hashanah l'Chasidus, should be celebrated. One of the stories that goes along with this letter, L'chol ho admoirim shlita, is the story that happened with the Belzer Rebbe. Okay, and I am going to now tell you a little bit of background about the Belzer Rebbe. I read about the Belzer Rebbe, and I heard about the Belzer Rebbe, and I'm very curious about the Belzer Rebbe. The Belzer Rebbe was a piece of godliness. The man was so skinny, and he ate so little that in the hot summer days he walked around with a coat because he was cold. He was skin and bones. Skin and bones, literally. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, described him to the current Belzer Rebbe, to his nephew, Anish Atzura B'lichoymer Mufshet V'Gashmis, a neshama without a guf removed from the world. He was so holy. He was godly. He was a Ruach Kodesh Golo. He was an incredibly holy man. According to the Reshivas, the Rebbe met him twice. The first time that I've met him was in Berlin. He came to Berlin to see an eye doctor. The Rebbe had a friend, a Gerach Chassid, a modern man, a Gerach Chassid, who lived in Berlin, who told the Rebbe that the Belzer Rebbe is coming. So the Rebbe got excited, and the Rebbe said to him, the Rebbe used very, very, very lofty accolades in referencing him. He was a malach. And by the way, when he came to Berlin, he just became a Rebbe. He became a Rebbe in 1927. The Rebbe left Berlin in 1932. So it was mamish the beginning of his tenure. But the Rebbe knew who he was. And the Rebbe said to this Gerach Chassid, I want to go see the Belzer. So they went. The Belzer Rebbe used to give shalom. Like all the Chassidish Rebbes. In Chabad, we don't shake a Rebbe's hand. In other Chassidus, shaking the Rebbe's hand is a big deal. It's a part of the Chassidus. So the Belzer Rebbe was giving shalom. But the Belzer didn't shake people's hand. He had a towel wrapped around his hand. A towel. And it was hanging down. You shook the towel, and that was the shalom. And he was sleeping. He just... You had no idea if he was aware, if he wasn't aware. This was classic Belzer, the Helika Belzer. Believe me, he was not sleeping. He was just, that was his derech. And people are filing by, that came to Berlin. Many people came to Chassid to see him, and I promise you, not all Belzer Chassidim, and they shook the towel. The Rebbe walks up to the Belzer, he picks up his head, looks at him, takes the towel off, shakes the Rebbe's hand, puts the towel back on, and goes back to sleep. That's the whole story. They didn't exchange a word. The Belzer Rebbe, when the Rebbe walks up to the Belzer Rebbe, he opens up his eyes like as if he'd been asleep, looks at the Rebbe, takes the towel off, shakes the Rebbe's hand with his skin, puts the towel back on, and goes back to sleep. He's sleeping. That's the Belzer Rebbe. And there was an eyewitness. There's a rumor that he said Avar Mahant, but according to a reliable version of the story, Chaskel Besser heard it from the person who was with the Rebbe, they didn't exchange a word. He just simply looked at the Rebbe, gave the Rebbe his hand, and put the top away by chain. A few years after the Belzerov was in Perkesdorf was a resort city. It was like a vacation place near Vienna in Austria. And all the Gedolim went to Perkesdorf. The Friedrich Rebbe told the Rebbe and the Rashag to give Shalom to the Belzer. The Friedrich Rebbe sent them. So the Belzer Rebbe is walking with an entourage, with a few Chassidim. And the Rebbe and the Rashag are walking opposite them. This is a story told by, I forgot who, but it's written in this photo. And they walked into the Belzer. The Rashag gave the Belzer Rebbe his hand. The Belzer shook his hand 3 times, as was his custom. The Rebbe handed the Belzer Rebbe his hand, and he stood there holding the Rebbe's hand for 10 minutes, not exchanging a word. That's the story. 10 minutes. 10 minutes he held the Rebbe's hand, and then they kept going. So the Belzer Rebbe is now blind. He's living in Israel, and he gets a letter from our Rebbe, L'chol ad moedim shlita. The Belzer Rebbe was the same age as the Friedrich Rebbe. He survived. He lived 77 years. He passed away in 1957. When I was a kid growing up, I had all kinds of Chassidish friends and neighbors, and they used to teach the Belzer Chassidim that they don't have a Rebbe. Because the Belzer Rebbe passed away in 1957, the current Belzer Rebbe was 6 or 7 years old. He was a baby. So they didn't really have a Rebbe. And the Satmar kids used to tease the Belzer kids that they don't have a Rebbe, and the Belzer kids would get very insulted and say, of course we have a Rebbe. He's young, but I remember when the Belzer Rebbe came to Crown Heights, he was 22 years old. You know where he verbringt? In Beis Rivka. It was called the Crown Heights Yeshiva. I remember going with my Shapiro friends, my neighbors. They were big Belzer Chassidim to watch. He was much a boy. He was 22 years old. But the kids used to tease each other. They don't have a Rebbe. His uncle was a shtick getlakai. So the Belzer Rebbe, who's now blind, gets a letter from our Rebbe. It was a standard letter. The Belzer Rebbe's Gabbai, he gave an Anshel Fogel, who was a good guy. He was a Chassidish Yid, a very Chassidish Yid. But he had no idea who the Rebbe was. And he comes into the Belzer Rebbe laughing. A naye yinge Rebbe from America, nar ivri evet, a new young Rebbe from America. Sent the Rebbe a brief, sent the Rebbe a letter with instructions, telling the Belzer Rebbe what he should do. So he thought it was funny that a young Rebbe in America is telling the Belzer Rebbe what to do, and the Belzer Rebbe gets excited. And I heard 2 different versions of the story. The version I heard, which I think is more reliable, he said, nein, from the greatest Rebbes. No, he's from the greatest Rebbes. The Rebbe wasn't even Rebbe officially. But people like this, he met him. They physically met. The Rebbe met him. And the Belzer Rebbe didn't need more. He knew exactly who the Rebbe was. And when the Rebbe became a Rebbe, he wasn't even officially Rebbe. He says to his Gabbai, you don't know what you're talking about. This is the real deal. 9, and from the greatest Rebbes. The other version, which we heard growing up, was, he said to him, Anshel zi zirik, the spiel sich mit fire. You better take your words back, because you're playing with fire. The Belzer Rebbe knew who the Rebbe was. And I heard from a friend, a colleague of mine, who's much older than I am, that the Rebbe made it his business, that every single Fabrengen that he said, every single Maimer that he said, when they would give the Rebbe a Hanocha, the Rebbe would personally send a copy to the Belzer Rebbe. The Rebbe sent every Sikh and every Maimer from the very beginning of his Nesius. The Rebbe wanted the Belzer Rebbe, who was blind, he couldn't even see. The Belzer Rebbe could see, by the way, without seeing also. He's one of those. The Belzer Rebbe should get a copy of every Sikh and every Maimer that the Rebbe gave out. The Rebbe personally sought with the Belzer Rebbe. That's the kind of relationship they had. They didn't exchange too many words, but that was the kind of relationship. Anyway, this is one of the stories that happened. Parenthetically, there is an identical story with the great-grandfather of Reb Adam Belzer, Reb Sholem Belzer, and the Rebbe's great-grandfather, the Rebbe Marash. The Rebbe Marash was Kvayachal, a young businessman traveling, and he traveled on Shlichus of the Tzemach Tzedek undercover for Askonis, and he came into Belz. The Belzer Rebbe was blind, and 2 people led him into the room, and then as soon as he walked in, it was Margish that the Rebbe Marash was there. He let go of his supporters, his people holding him, and he went over to the Rebbe Marash. He shook his hand, and he asked him who he was. And the Chassidim said he looked modern. He was dressed in modern dress. And he himself said, Ayida Soicher. So the Belzer version of the story goes that the Belzer Rebbe said, Yo, Kitei Sachre Mikol Schreira. And the Belzer Rebbe shot him on, he asked him who he was, and he told him who he was, and he shot him onto the bimah. And the way the story goes is that the Belzer Rebbe taught him the side of Shirayim, and he gave the Belzer Chassidim Shirayim. He was very impressed, the Rebbe Marash, with his unbelievable Ruach HaKodesh. So when he came back to Lubavitch, he told his father, the Tzemach Tzedek. So the Tzemach Tzedek said to him, was hast du getracht? Von einer offenen Baal Ruach HaKodesh hast du getracht behalten? What were you thinking? From a person would open Ruach HaKodesh, you were thinking to hide, and then 4 generations later, the story repeats itself. This was Yutas Kislev, okay? Now it's getting closer to Yud Shvat. By the way, in Israel, they put this letter that I just described in the newspaper. They put in the newspaper the letter that the Rebbe wrote to Chol HaAdmor to all the Rebbes. So they asked the Rebbe how they should entitle it. The son-in-law of the Lubavitcher Rebbe writes a letter, and the Rebbe allowed them to put in the newspaper Kvei Kedushat Admor Shlitim Lubavitch. The first time they allowed themselves to use the expression Kvei Kedushat Admor Shlitim Lubavitch was Yutas Kislev in Eretz Yisrael. As they got closer to Yud Shvat, it became clearer and clearer that it was only a matter of time. But if you watch the film that they gave out, did you guys see the film they gave out, Jem gave out for Yud Shvat? Did you see the film?
Some parts of it.
It's 9 minutes. It's very poignant. And one of the things that they write, Gurari says, Ichimei says, that until it happened, we didn't know what was going to happen. Even though it was so clear to us that it was a matter of time, the Rebbe Kabolas Hanesius, but the Rebbe always was equivocal. He never said outright, I'm doing it. There was always something we were not sure. Until the Rebbe actually said the first Maimed, we didn't know what was going to be. It was equivocal, push up to the last second. Nevertheless, as I'm starting to tell you, as we got closer and closer to Yud Shvat, it became more and more apparent that it was simply a matter of time before the Rebbe would be Kabolas Hanesius. Amongst the big events that happened, and there's a story, and again, I've been told that the story may not be true, but I think it's true, and to say it more directly, I want it to be true, so I'm telling you the Maise. The Maise was that Harav Chazanovsky had a dream. Chavdal Tapes had a dream. In his dream, he sees that Fabrengen, Bam Friedrich Rebbe upstairs, as it was for the last 10 years, and the Friedrich is sitting at the head of the table. The Rashag is sitting on the Friedrich's right. The Rebbe is sitting on the Friedrich's left. And the Friedrich is sitting at the head of the table. And the Friedrich looks around at the Chassidim, and he turns to Kazanovsky in the dream. And he says, why is everybody so sad? Why is there such a bad mood? So Kazanovsky tells the Rebbe, because you abandoned us. You left us. That's why we're sad. So the Friedrich says to Kazanovsky in his dream, but I left you the Rebbe. And he calls the Rebbe by name. I left you the Ramash. So Kazanovsky in the dream says to the Friedrich Rebbe, but he keeps on saying, you're still the Rebbe. He keeps insisting, you're still the Rebbe and he's not a Rebbe. So in the dream, the Friedrich Rebbe turns to our Rebbe and he quotes psukim from our Pasha of Beshalach. Ma titzak Eloi. Daber abnei Yisrael v'Yisrael. Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Ma titzak Eloi. Teach in Yiddish. Favos schreibst du wegen Hiskashrus zu mir? Why are you writing about being connected to, why are you saying that people should be connected to me? Daber abnei Yisrael, zok chsidis zu Yidden, v'Yisrael vel ze foren an kegen Mashiach. V'Yisrael vel shat Mashiach. In the dream, the Friedrich Rebbe says to the Rebbe, why are you keep talking about me? Say Chassidus and you'll go to Mashiach. Favos schreist du wegen Hiskashrus zu mir, zok chsidis zu Yidden, vel an kegen Mashiach. So Kazanovsky get up in the morning and he runs to 770. He runs into the Rebbe all excited. He says, Rebbe, I got a dream for you. So the Rebbe asked him to tell the whole dream. The Rebbe listened. And as was typical, the Rebbe probably asked him to say it a second time. And after he finished, the Rebbe says to him, it's not a real dream. It's a nice dream, but you must have been thinking about it by day. It's not a real dream. So Kazanovsky says, how do you know? So it was because I didn't have the same dream. If it would have been real, I would have had the same dream also. That was how the Rebbe snuck out of that one. On that day, Chassidim put an official ad in the paper announcing that they're Makabel the Rebbe as the Nasi of the 7th Nasi of Lubavitch. Which is 16 days before Yud Shvat, 50 days before Yud Shvat. When this ad was put in the paper, somebody ran into the Rebbe, our Rebbe, screaming and shouting, look what the Chassidim did. They wrote in the paper that you're agreeing to be a Rebbe. So the Rebbe called in Chadakov, who was his personal secretary, and he said to Rebbe Chadakov, you have to put in a denial. You have to put in the Dista Chassidim wrote that Kabolas Hanesius isn't true. So Rebbe Chadakov got very nervous. So he called Reb Shmuel, who was a big chassid, and he said to him what happened. The Rebbe wants to put in a denial. And he says to Reb Shmuel like this, I'm the Rebbe's secretary, I work for him. I am going to put in this denial. You have 3 hours to fix it. He gave him 3 hours to fix it. So Reb Shmuel ran into the Rebbe to try and reason with him. When Rebbe Shmuel ran to the Rebbe, other people ran in. Kazanovsky ran in. Kazanovsky started to cry and scream at the Rebbe. To scream at him. You can't do this to us. He was so frustrated. He was such a big chassid. He was so dedicated. You can't do this to us. You're the Rebbe. He said things like you're the same Rebbe as the Alter Rebbe, something like this. But you can't do this to us. But the Rebbe says he's putting it in denial. Rebbe Shmuel said to the Rebbe, I don't understand. We didn't write in the newspaper that you're accepting to be a Rebbe. We wrote in the newspaper that we're making you a Rebbe. You can't deny what we say. The Rebbe told him. Shmuel said to the Rebbe, we didn't write that you're accepted. We wrote that we're accepting you. What are you going to say? You're not the Rebbe? The denial was never put in. Bottom line is, the Rebbe told Chadakov to leave it. That was a huge moment. That Chadal Tevis, where they put an ad in the paper, announcing, there were a newspaper article, that Lubavitcher Hasidim are accepting the Rebbe as a Rebbe. And that initially the Rebbe wanted to put in a denial, and then the Rebbe didn't put it in, was a huge step forward. Then comes Rosh Chodesh, Yud Shvat, 10 days before Yud Shvat. Rosh Chodesh Shvat, the Rebbe wrote a letter. And the letter is really quite official. It's quite official. The Rebbe is writing as the son-in-law, but it's a very official letter. And in the letter he writes, Minhagim of Yud Shvat. What people should do in Yud Shvat, they should go to the oil, they should write a pidyon, they should learn from the Maimer, they should divide up the tefillas, they should give extra tzedakah, they should go around to the different Jews, especially the young people, and talk to them how much free they get, but love them, all kinds of things. This was considered an official letter, and every year, Yud Shvat, we learned that letter. Then when we have the Kunteris of Basi Lagani, it includes also this. This letter is a very basic part of Yud Shvat. The Rebbe wrote Rosh Chodesh, and it was another sign that it really was only a matter of time before the Rebbe would officially accept the Nesiah. But again, as you watch this 9-minute film that Jen gave out, Zalman Harari, Ishameya says, until it happened, we didn't know what was going to happen. We had a pretty good idea what was going to happen, but the entire time the Rebbe kept on equivocating. He would not say straight, yeah, until it happened. But Poyel, nobody knew that it was going to happen. Okay, now you get to Yud Shvat itself. So first of all, there was a Fabrengen upstairs. The Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe Medina, made a Fabrengen in the Friedrich's apartment on Tuesday evening, the night before Yud Shvat. She invited the Rebbe, the Rashag, and a group of elder Hasidim. They sat at the table. They sang a few Nagunim. Nobody said a word. It was quite a sad or depressed kind of a mood. The Rebbe sat there. The Rebbe didn't budge. This was the night before. They had put ads in the paper, put ads in the newspaper, that the next day there was going to be a minyan for the Rebbe. Kvei Giddush Amur Shlita Melubavitch is going to daven for Yomit. Hadmur Harama Shlita. And that after davening, everyone's going to go to the oil with specially prepared buses. And at night, at 8 o'clock or 8:30, there was going to be a Fabrengen of Kvei Giddush Hadmur Harama Shlita. It was official, in the newspaper, paid for by Merkers. In other words, the Rebbe himself sanctioned that they should use the word Admur Shlita on him, and put in the paper that on Yud Shvat, the Rebbe is going to do these things, daven for Yomid, and make a Fabrengen, and people were invited. This was like that was all very official. The Rebbe's involved in this, even though the private talk of the Rebbe was quite unofficial. You want to say something?
Which newspaper is this?
There was Yiddish newspapers, Tag Morgen Journal. In those days, you read Yiddish newspapers. They were not necessarily from, but they were Yiddish. So it was the Tag Morgen Journal. There were all these newspapers way back.
What was with the Rashag?
Torah the Rashag person, within a year or two, he did a 180. He became the Rebbe's biggest chassid. The Rashag was so dedicated to the Rebbe, he realized that he wasn't in the same league. You know, I have a friend of mine who's a relative of Kazanovsky's. Kazanovsky used to travel with the Rashag to raise money for the yeshiva. So Kazanovsky said to him, Shmerel, was es getracht? Shmerel, what were you thinking? You're going to be a Rebbe like the Rebbe's Rebbe? So he said, I thought I have koiches as an Edom, that I'll take the job, the Rebbe will give me koiches. But I realized that I made a huge mistake. He was not by the Fabrengen in Yud Shvat. He didn't come till maybe the next Simchas Teda or something or other. But within a relatively short time, he showed up and he became very, very dedicated to the Rebbe. There's no question about that. There's a rumor that goes around, and I know where the rumor comes from. The night before Yud Shvat, the Rebbe called someone to come to his house. And when he came to the house, he found the Rebbe Poshet preparing the Maimer. He claims he saw the Rebbe had different svarim open and writing notes in a notebook, which we've never been found. Presumably, supposedly, allegedly, preparing the Maimer of Basi Lagan, he would say the next night. Which, of course, the Rebbe, until the Maimer actually came, behaved like as if the Maimah was not at all prepared. The story that goes around is that night, the night before the Rebbe became a Rebbe, they got into a car, to a taxi, and drove a great distance to help some family with some problem. Pasha physically helped people. The Rebbe told Moshe Gerono to stay in the house, and the Rebbe went out for a very long time to Pasha help an individual couple, an individual family. Begashmis, the night before the Rebbe became officially Rebbe. He was, in other words, the Rebbe was practicing what he preached. He wasn't telling us what we should do, he was doing it himself. So the next day, there was a Shachris minyan, there was a B'yomit, they all went to the oil, they all came back, and then Minche, and of course, Fabregas was called for 8, I think it was called for 8:30. The story was that all this time, Hasidim were writing and sending Kisvei Hiskashos. Kisvei Hiskashos means citations, it means letters, it means notes of declaring loyalty to the Rebbe and accepting the Rebbe as the Nasi of Lubavitch. So for weeks now and months, people had been sending Kisvei Hiskashos from all over. The Hasidim who were in New York physically went into the Rebbe to physically hand them the Ksav Hiskashos that they wrote, declaring themselves loyal to the Rebbe. And they wrote to the Rebbe, of course, we're going to be as dedicated to you as you were to our father and to your father-in-law and other things like that. They went into the Rebbe. The Rebbe was sitting and learning Mishnayos. They handed the Rebbe the Pidyon. The Rebbe started to read it, and as soon as he saw what it said, he started to cry uncontrollably. And he said, this is mamish hours before the Fabrengen. Das hat mit mir den ganzen kein Scheiches. This has nothing to do with me. Like there's been no negotiating going on. And they're standing there, and the Rebbe is crying. And then at a certain point, the Rebbe realized that they're standing and looking at him cry. So he said, F shivet eroisken, please. Maybe you'll walk out and let me cry in peace, So they walked out. This was right before the Fabrengen. The Rebbe came late to the Fabrengen. The Fabrengen was called for 8 or 8:30. The Rebbe came after 9 o'clock. Where did the Rebbe go? You know? He went to see his mother. Now, wouldn't you want to be a fly on the wall in that house and hear that conversation? The Rebbe's mother knew from her husband that the Rebbe was going to be a Rebbe. She knew it. The Rebbe knew that the Rebbe was going to be a Rebbe. I'm assuming, without knowing, because I was not a fly on the wall, that the Rebbe had Pasha messages that she gave over to the Rebbe when the Rebbe officially accepted the Messiah, the Rebbe Levi had certain things that he wanted his son to know. He told his wife, when the time comes, she should share it with the Rebbe. The Rebbe Pasha came very late to the Fabrengen, which was totally out of character. The Rebbe was always, spot on about the time. He came late because he was busy with his mother. He says before talking about whatever it was that they were talking about. I mentioned this to you the other day that the Rebbe's mother kept a journal, a diary. She makes not one reference of Fiedler passing away, of all the politics of the Rebbe becoming Rebbe. Nothing. She makes no mention of it. It's clear that she's not mentioning it because she appreciates. It seems to me that she's not mentioning this. She appreciates the best thing she can do is be quiet about it. Anyway, finally, the Rebbe comes into the Fabrengen. The place is packed to the rafters. You can't get in. All the Hasidim from the tri-state area, from New Haven, from Montreal, from Connecticut, New Jersey, and so on, came to the Fabrengen. In addition, there were many, many onlookers, stam people who were not Lubavitchers, who were just curious to know how Lubavitch makes a Rebbe. There's a girl in this room whose grandfather was not a Lubavitcher at all. He was a Talmud in YU University. And a bunch of Chevra from YU decided, let's go check this Lubavitcher Rebbe out. Their Rebbe, their Sheshiv was a Beshabeh Soloveitchik. Beshabeh knew the Rebbe from Berlin, and they were friends, and they knew it. They knew that the Beshabeh respected the Rebbe. So like 7 or 8 guys from YU decided to come to 770 just to see how it happens. One of those 7 men showed up and never left. How do I know this? He told it to me himself. He said, the first time I came to the Rebbe was when the Rebbe became Rebbe. I was by that first Fabrengen, and I was sold. His other 6 friends went back to YU. He also went back to YU to finish his smicha and so on. But he was sold on the Rebbe, became a Lubavitcher. The day the Rebbe became a Rebbe, he had a new chassid, you understand? Right? That's the story. He told it me himself. People came from all over. The place was packed. Moshe Herson says you couldn't walk. No place to move. The room was small. The Cheder Sheni was open. What is now the secretary's office, the doors were open. It was a little bit bigger. People were out into the street. They ever walked into the room and you couldn't get through. Now, there's another thing which is told, that when they prepared the Fabrengen for the Rebbe, they made 2 different seats for him. They were very careful not to make the Rebbe do something he wasn't comfortable with. So they put his old seat where he used to sit when he Fabrenged Shabbos Mevorachim, which is like the back of the show. They also put a seat in the center of the show, at the far end of the room, which was a much more mechavedik place. And they let the Rebbe choose where he wants to sit. So Moshe Herson was a boy. How old could he have been? 14, 15. He was standing in the corner on the bimah. The Rebbe walks in and he sees there's no place. The Rebbe was very agile, very, very, very athletic. He put one foot on the bench, another foot on the table, and in 2 seconds he was in his place. He just skipped it. Before anybody could make room for him, the Rebbe Pasha skipped across the table like he was walking on water. Boom, he was in his place. He didn't want to displace people. In other words, the Rebbe, the covet was so unimportant to him, and helping people was like just, maybe she slithered across the tables. He said it took a second, and the Rebbe was in his place. And the Fabrengen started, and the Fabrengen was very warm. The Hasidim were very happy. They were saying L'chaim and singing Nigunim, and the Rebbe is speaking. Now you have to understand, in the very beginning of the Fabrengen, the Rebbe made an official statement. It was an official statement for Kabolas and Hanesius. And he said that there's a custom in America, and the Rebbe said, I don't know if you have to imitate all customs, but it does say in Chazal that when you come to a land, you have to imitate its customs. But when you take a new position, you have to make a statement. The statement has to be a chidush davar, has to be something novel, and something which is overwhelming. Maval al arayim. Says the Rebbe, I'm not sure how radical it has to be, but my statement is, and the Rebbe said, my statement is, if you need a statement, my statement is that the Friedrich Rebbe used to say that there's 3 ahavas. There's avas ha-Torah, and avas Yisrael, and avas Hashem. Love of Torah, love of Israel, love of Hashem. And the Rebbe says these 3 loves are inseparable. You have to have all 3 together. If you have 2 without the third, or 1 without the other 2, it's not going to work. And he went through all the different pratim. So the Rebbe sort of made an official statement. But the Reval is no Ma'ameh Chassidus. And again, the way the story is told, the label grower kept telling his people next to him to ask the Rebbe to say a maimed, and the Rebbe said to the people next to the label grower was 21 years old, 20 years old. And he had a sense that Rebbe was going to say a maimed, so he was telling the people near him they should ask the Rebbe for a Ma'ameh Chassidus. And the Rebbe said that little boy doesn't know what he's talking about. And finally, an old chassid got up on the table, an old chassid. His name was Sender Nemtzev. Sender Nemtzev was the father-in-law of Reb Nissen Mendel, who was the Friedrich Rebbe's secretary. He gets up on the table, and he says, the chassidim, the sichas are wonderful. We're all enjoying the sichas. But der Eilam bet chassidus. The people want the Rebbe should say a maimed. Nimtza chen, the Rebbe should have rachmanis, and he should say a maimed chassidus. It's about 20 minutes to 11, Wednesday night, Yitzvat Eli Yadafat. So the Rebbe smiles, looks up at Sender Nemtzev, and he motions with his hand that he should sit down like Beroyik. And then the Rebbe opened the kuntris, the pamphlet of Yitzvat was sitting on the Rebbe's table, and the Rebbe opened it, and he started reading inside. And he said, in the Maimer was the Rebbe Tarois gegeben Parazayin Yem HaHilula, Heipteron Basi Lagani. In the Maimer which the Rebbe gave out for his Yortzeit, he begins with the words Basi Lagani, and then he continues, Basi Lagani Achesi Kala, and there's a pause. Zot, and another pause. And each pause is like 3-4 seconds. Lagan ein ksiv kan ela lagani lignuni. And again a pause. And each time the Rebbe pauses, you can hear on the tape, in the background, the people are getting very excited. They're screaming, Shtel Tzchavek. The Rebbe saying, Amayim, won't you stand up? But the Rebbe says, Amayim, they won't stand up. So people stood up. The Rebbe said the Amayim. As the Amayim progressed, the Rebbe became more and more comfortable. And he began to say the Amayim in a more strong voice. After like 15 minutes, the Rebbe stopped. And he asked if they should sing 2 Nigunim. And then the Rebbe continued the Maimer for another 15 minutes. Then he stopped the second time and sang 2 more Nigunim. Then he finished the Maimer and said again 2 Nigunim. Because the Rebbe wanted, in the Maimer Abbasi the guy that first year, the Rebbe mentioned each Rebbe 5 times. He mentioned them in 2 Taitas for the Rabbeim. He told one story of the Rabbeim. He mentioned all the names of the Rabbeim, and then he sang a nigun of each one of the Rabbeim. So in the course of the Maimer, the Rebbe stopped twice to sing 2 Nugon, and then he continued the Maimer. And of course, the Rebbe's Maimer wasn't Samazaya Maimer. The Rebbe's Maimer included the statement about Deira Shvi, we're the 7th generation. Was the 7th generation that the Shvi and Lanisha would come after the first, and our job is to Mamshech HaShechina Lamata Baris. I mean, the Rebbe spoke so unequivocally. The Rebbe's first Maimer was a mission statement for our generation, and was not finished yet. Until Mashiach comes, that mission statement is not complete. When the Rebbe said it seemed so fly by that, so pie in the sky. So unbelievably unreasonable. And you look today, we think Lubavitch is a great success. Lubavitch is in the beginning of its success. It's going to be 100 times as big. Because the Rebbe put koiches. And the Rebbe said that our inyas be mamshel d'shchina l'mata baros to make it actually occur. This was the Maimer. After the Maimer, there was again a nigun, and then the Rebbe said a short speech, a little sikh. It begins with the words, It's der Herzach ein Yid. Now listen, Jews. You shouldn't think You appointed a person, and you made him a Rebbe, and he's going to sweat, and all you guys are going to go back to sleep. He says, I got a secret for you. Any shlichus, any mission you have to feed the Rebbe, you're going to have to complete. And I'm not going to do it for you. I'll help you, but everybody's work has to be done by themselves. He said in Chabad, the whole idea was you don't rely on the Rebbe, you have to do the work yourself. He even used the words, Ubefrat, that it's handizach men nish videm Rebbe sanedim, especially if we're dealing about a son-in-law of the Rebbe. But the Rebbe made it clear, after the first Maimed, that he wasn't becoming a Rebbe to do the work for us. The Rebbe said the first Maimed, he's becoming a Rebbe, we're going to have to work with him, and that's exactly how it played out. The Rebbe demanded a lot from Chassidim. The Rebbe had a brother named Label. He lived in Tel Aviv. He moved later to England. Before he moved to England, he went to see his friends, faceless, Goldschmidt, Nachum Goldschmidt. He came into his house, and Nachum Goldschmidt says, I know exactly the spot where he stood. And the Rebbe's father said to him, number one, I want you to do everything in your power to see to it that my brother becomes the Rebbe. Label said, do everything you have to do to become the Rebbe. And he told him, you should know, you have no idea who my brother is. When he becomes the Rebbe, he's going to put you guys to work. If you think you're working hard now, he's going to make you work 10 times as hard. And that's exactly how it played out. That when the Rebbe became a Rebbe, he immediately began to push Hasidim to go beyond their comfort zones and to do incredible things. Anyway, the Rebbe walked out of the Fabrengen around 12:30. Really lasted around 3 hours. When the Rebbe walked out, they started to sing and dance and to chazer the Maimed. The singing and dancing was so real, people described it. The singing and dancing, as a guy told me, and old Jews in their 70s and 80s were jumping up and down like school children. When the Rebbe officially took the job, the simcha by Hasidim was so real. He says, Alte Yidden am gekopet, the hopket wie kleine Kinder, because they were so afraid the Rebbe wouldn't take it. And they so understood how good it was that the Rebbe did take it. When the Rebbe was finally makabel in the Hanesius officially, the simcha in 770 was overwhelming. Mamish was incredible. The Rebbe became a Rebbe Wednesday night. Yud Shvat, Yud Tovshin Yud Aleph. The girls in the last class asked me what happened Yud Shvat, what happened Yud Aleph Shvat. So we managed to make a whole thing out of nothing. And when the Fabrengen finished, the Hasidim were just elated. They were so happy. Because a great thing had occurred. A great thing had occurred was they understood how important it was for the Rebbe to become Rebbe, and as I explained to you repeatedly, they also understood that they had changed the Rebbe's mind. It was a really holy, special undertaking that was successful. Klayachol, they turned the Rebbe's Deya, which is a remarkable thing. A remarkable thing. So they tell a story that the next morning the Rebbe came to Kriyas HaTorah. Now you have to remember how the Rebbe looked. If you looked in his eyes, you saw fire. But you looked at the Rebbe casually, he was a well-dressed, handsome young man. That's what he was. Little tiny beard, tucked in so beautifully. There wasn't a gray hair in his beard. He was almost 49. He was almost 49. The Rebbe wasn't young. The Rebbe was the latest of all the Rebbe. In age, the Rebbe was the latest to become Rebbe, and he had the longest Nesias. No Rebbe became a Rebbe at that age, and everything about him was youthful. So the story goes, he came into 770, he picked up a little siddur, a little siddurim. I remember these siddurim. I mean, I remember a time in 770 it was impossible to find a siddur. And this was 25 years after the Rebbe became a Rebbe. For years and years, he couldn't find a siddur, he couldn't find a chumash. This little tiny siddur called Tfilas U'Brachas, where the type was tiny, nothing was repeated twice, so every tefillah by the tzei would say look by shachas. Aleinu would look by shachas. It was one of those siddurim, they in a few pages had a whole siddur. And it must have been battered. They picked it up, and then the back they had Kriyas HaTorah. He opened it up and he folded it back. He folded it back like he would fold back a kuntres, This is the Sikha. This is the book. It was closed like this. They opened it and it was like this. He was holding it like this. And a man who wasn't about to walked in, and he sees a young man holding a siddur stretched inside out, like you hold a chicken by kapodes. And the Rebbe says to him, Yinga man, nicht azoi halt man a siddur. He says, young man, that's not how you hold a siddur. So the Rebbe opened it up and held it respectably. I heard this story. I really believe that it's true. I believe it's true because you can see the Rebbe doing it. But it gives you an idea of how how small everything was. The Rebbe became a Rebbe. The night before, 770 was in the heights of heaven. And the next day, a guy walks in and sees the Rebbe, calls him Yin Yaman. In other words, on the one hand, it was such a big deal. On the other hand, it was not a big deal at all. I mean, it was so there were a dime a dozen Rebbes in Brooklyn at that time. There were more Rebbes then than there are now. And some of them were pretty nice guys. Okay, Dacha Rebbe. Okay, the son of the Jewish paper, Lubavitch has a Rebbe. You didn't even look twice. And the guy tells the Rebbe, the day after he becomes Rebbe, not how you hold, don't hold sit like this first days. That same morning, this I heard from Rabbi Groner, I heard this from Label Groner. The Rebbe came into shul, into the office, and the Rebbe had secretaries. So I want to give you a little bit of description of the Rebbe's secretaries. The Frierdiker Rebbe had a number of secretaries. Of course, the first secretary of the Frierdiker Rebbe was our Rebbe. But there was Rabbi Chadakov, there was Nissen Mendel, there was a Jew whose name you don't even hear much, his name was Rabbi Quinn. I forgot his first name. He was Quint. He was not a Lubavitcher. He worked for the Frierdiker Rebbe and he worked for the Rebbe. He was clean shaven. As was Nissen Mendel, by the way. The Rebbe told Rabbi Groner about Rabbi Quint. He's a Baki B'Shas. You can ask him any place in Shas. He was a big lam. He worked for the Rebbe for many, many years. And he knew who the Rebbe was. He had great respect for the Rebbe. He wasn't a Lubavitcher, but he was the Rebbe's secretary. He was the Frierdiker Rebbe's secretary yet. Then there was Rabbi Chadakov. There was Rabbi Nissen Mendel. There was Rabbi Rothstein. There was Rabbi Shaleb Rothstein. Rabbi Rothstein, who worked for the Frierdiker Rebbe, also he wrote letters. And then there was Chaim Lieberman. That was the secretary of the Frierdiker Rebbe. When the Rebbe took over the Hanesius, he basically took all these people onto his team, except Chaim Lieberman. And I don't know if Chaim Lieberman the Rebbe didn't ask for, or Chaim Lieberman declined, because that had to do with the teams, unfortunately, at that time. But Rabbi Chadakov became the Rebbe's right hand. Chadakov had worked with the Rebbe before. The Rebbe liked Rabbi Chadakov. The Rebbe held Rabbi Chadakov in very high esteem. Rabbi Chadakov really was the person closest to the Rebbe throughout the Messias. It's not even a question. Rabbi Chadakov was so close to the Rebbe, you don't even see him as a person. He's like the Rebbe's shadow. There's no stories about Rabbi Chadakov. There's nothing to tell. Because everything he said was the Rebbe's words. He wasn't his own person, Rabbi Chadakov. And Rabbi Chadakov was very big Yerei Shamayim. He was incredibly frum. He was an Oivid D'Lekim. The Rebbe once told someone about Rabbi Chadakov that he sleeps fewer hours than I do. And the Rebbe didn't sleep a lot at all. Rabbi Chadakov was the closest person to the Rebbe. Rabbi Rothstein, who had been the secretary of the Frierdiker Rebbe, he continued working for the Rebbe. And as I understand it, Rabbi Rothstein was the spirit of the Maskiras. Rabbi Chadakov was the head of the Maskiras. But Rabbi Rothstein learned in Lubavitch. Rabbi Rothstein was a Chassidish Yid. Not that Rabbi Chadakov wasn't a Chassidish Yid, but he didn't know the tradition because he didn't really grow up. I mean, I once asked his daughter, Rabbi Chadakov came from a Lubavitcher shtul, but he didn't grow up in Russia. He grew up in Riga, in Latvia, which was a modern city. Rabbi Rothstein had the feel for how a Maskiras of the Rebbe should work. And he sort of brought, Rabbi Groner says this, the spirit of the Maskiras Rabbi Rothstein brought in. Rabbi Rothstein used to go into the Rebbe every single day of the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, for dictation. The Rebbe had time, they would dictate letters. And he would sit there and take notes, and then he would spend the entire day writing up all the letters in Hebrew and Yiddish Rabbi Rothstein wrote. And as long as he was alive, the Rebbe wrote hundreds of letters a week. When Rabbi Rothstein passed away, which was the beginning of 19, Tafshin Chav Ches, the end of 67, the Rebbe Pasha did not replace him. He didn't replace him. So the Maskiras had to do the same jobs with a person less. So the Rebbe's volume of letter writing dropped precipitously. He wrote many fewer letters. I mean, there were still hundreds of letters a week that the Rebbe sent out, but compared to what was before, it was much less, and the letters were shorter. And instead, the Rebbe used to have what's called minus. The Rebbe used to write on your letter, and the secretaries would call you up. It was interesting. If the Rebbe wrote a minus, the rule of the minus were that they were not allowed to give you the original. You could copy it, but the original was supposed to say Maskiras. The secretaries were supposed to burn them, and evidently some of them were not burnt because thousands and thousands and thousands of them have appeared in the Kfar Chabad magazine, in the Beis Mashiach magazine, and all kinds of other publications. All of this should have been burnt. SBB should have been burnt, stuff. So Rabbi Rothstein was very, very important. He was a maskir of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he also became a maskir of the Rebbes. I'll get back to Rabbi Rothstein a little bit later. In addition, there was Nissen Mendel. Nissen Mendel was a modern man. Nissen Mendel Shver was a big chassid. Nissen Mendel Shver was the chassid who got up on the table and asked the Rebbe to say a maimer. He was his father. He's in Sender Nemtsev. This Mendel came from England. He was very intelligent. He was very well educated. And he knew many languages. He published all the English, all the stuff that came out from Americas in the 40s and 50s were his. The Talks and Tales were his. The Shmos were his. The complete story of Pesach was his. The skim story, it was all him. He was My People, My Prayer, it's all this Mendel. This Mendel actually translated the first section of the Tanya, and the Rebbe worked very close with him. Whatever this Mendel wrote, the Rebbe used to look over. And he wrote the Rebbe's letters in English, which was enormous. The English letters are arguably more than the Hebrew letters, and it's almost without a question that the English letters are more interesting than the Hebrew letters. Because of all kinds of reasons, they haven't even begun to publish the English letters. The Mendel Foundation, this Mendel's family is printing his letters in English. But in the archive of the Rebbe's, the English letters are there, and they're going to get to them if it's Hashem. So he wrote letters in English, and he also went to the Rebbe went 3 times a week. And in the beginning of the book, The Letter in the Spirit, Nissen Mendel describes how the Rebbe used to write letters. The Rebbe was on a clock. The Rebbe had a very, very precise schedule. And he had a certain amount of time every day prepared for letter writing, for Yiddish and Hebrew. And when that minute came, he stopped. The only way the Rebbe was able to do his job was he was incredibly, incredibly masudr. So the Rebbe didn't answer as many letters as he thought he needed to answer. He answered as many letters as the time would allow. And he would decide what letters went to the top of the pile and what letters went to the bottom of the pile. So Mendel would come into the Rebbe would read letters and tell him who the letter is for and dictate the answer, and then he would write it up, and he would of course write it out in longhand. They would just give him the kudus, and then they would edit it, and then it would be sent. And this was the same thing with Rabbi Rothstein. If the editing was a lot, if the Rebbe would write a lot in correcting the letter, then it would be retyped. If the editing was very small, then you would actually get the letter with the Rebbe's corrections. But each one of these men went into the Rebbe maybe for half an hour a day, and then they had more than 24 hours of work. He describes that when the Rebbe was very busy, the Rebbe would give Mendel a letter and tell him to read it. So Mendel is reading to the Rebbe out loud, a letter that somebody wrote him. While Mendel is reading a letter, the Rebbe would read 2 more. And then as soon as Mendel would finish reading, they would dictate the answer to all 3. He says the Rebbe would do 2 things at once, or 3 things at once, but it wasn't like he was divided into 3. There were 3 of him. Because he writes, Mendel, the Rebbe would read every single word and between the lines, and he could do 2-3 letters at one time. He did this on a regular basis, and he would see how precise the Rebbe's involvement. When the Rebbe didn't have time, he would read out loud while the Rebbe is reading something different and answer both. And they did the Rebbe's letters. And when Rabbi Rothstein passed away, and this Mendel took over the letters, so the English letters also suffered because it was one less person, and of course the volume was greater. So there was Rabbi Mendel, right? And then of course there was Rabbi Groner. So gesund sein. Rabbi Groner was a Bacher Sachakel. He was 20 years old. Rabbi Groner was a Lamden. Rabbi Groner was a Chassidish Bacher. He sat and learned David. He was a good boy. And the Rebbe Pashut needed help with the Maimorim. Sometimes the help was to edit the Maimon, sometimes was to run to the printer in Manhattan, things like this. So the story was, wait a minute, the Rebbe called Rabbi Groner out of the Beis HaMedrash around 1948 and told him to go someplace. So he did it. The next day the Rebbe called him again. The next Rebbe called him again. So at one point Rabbi Groner said to the Rebbe, with all due respect, I want to learn Torah. The Rebbe wasn't Rebbe yet. So the Rebbe tells Label, and I need you to do this for me. So he did it. And when the Rebbe became Rebbe, he automatically became a maskir, because he had been working for the Rebbe from before. And he was really the Misharos of the Rebbe. He would sit in the office, he would answer the phone. He didn't really answer letters. And over years he became very, very close to the Rebbe. Go ahead, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, the Rebbe's hired his secretaries himself. He said more.
Oh, I'm sure. There's nothing about the Rebbe that was equivocal. There was nothing about the Rebbe that was b'di'evet. When the Rebbe took the job, it was with the Leah Takeif. I'm hoping to have a little time to talk about this. I don't know this for a fact, but he told each one of them, you're working for me. The way it worked by the Rebbe was you had to quit and get rehired. Every Moisid, you had to quit and get rehired. It was an idea of this: the sun set and the sun rose, and you have a new boss, and you had to sign on 100% to have a new boss. And if you didn't like that, you were out.
But you had to quit after the 50 girls.
I don't know if it was actual, but yeah, the Rebbe made it very clear to anybody who worked for him, not just in the secretariat, any Moisid in the world, that there was a new boss. and you had to submit to the new boss. I heard from a very good source that Reb Zalman Gerari asked the Rebbe, what's going to do with Rashag, with his brother-in-law? And the Rebbe said, I'm going to take everything away from him, I'm going to give him everything back. Without upnemen and without upgeben tzedek, I'm going to take everything from him. Now, the Rebbe didn't take people's job, but they had to understand that there was a new sheriff in town. And everybody who worked with the Rebbe, certainly in the secretariat, understood that. This was not the Rebbe's son-in-law. This was the Rebbe. And if in your mind there was any question about that, you were out. The Rebbe didn't put up with people around him. Anybody who worked with the Rebbe worked so hard, and you almost never got a compliment. And forget about thank you. The Rebbe was such a critical boss. He was very loving, but he was a very tough boss. People worked day and night. They worked day and night. They didn't have a life. Ask Mrs. Groen. What about their family? Right? It was very difficult. It was a schus, but it was hard. Ask Mrs. Groen's children. It wasn't fun. It was a very hard job. And then the whole Lubavitch hated you because you didn't let me into the Rebbe. Their job was to be the meanie. The Rebbe didn't have infinite time. Anyway, then the Rebbe called in Shalom Mendel Simpson. He was a boy. He was a bocher. He was even younger than Label. No, same age as Label. And the Rebbe said to Rabbi Simpson, your father, Rabbi Eliyahu Simpson, was a big chassid, was the machnes of Meitzah Friedrich Rebbe. He was the person who took people into the Friedrich Rebbe. The Friedrich Rebbe's speech was hard to understand. Almost no one understood what he said, so you didn't go in alone. Now Yechidus, please stop playing with the bottle. Yechidus is very private. People do go into Yechidus to talk about the weather. They talk about things that they wouldn't talk about anybody in the world. And another guy walks in with you, it's kind of uncomfortable. Rabbi Simpson was so secretive. He never ever said a word about what happened in the Rebbe's room. I mean, the story of all stories is a man walked into the Rebbe, to the Friedrich with Rabbi Simpson, and he turns around to Rabbi Simpson and he says to Rabbi Simpson, I'll understand the Rebbe without your help. The Rebbe spoke to him, he didn't understand. He turned around to Rabbi Simpson and asked him, what did the Rebbe say? And he said, I wasn't listening. That was Rabbi Simpson. He was so secretive. So the Rebbe called in his son and said, your father knows how to keep a secret, and I'm assuming that you have similar genes. I want you to work for me. And he was also a secretary. He did a lot of behind-the-work things, and his primary, the thing that we know most of what he did was he was the Rebbe's archivist. He was 20. They were all kids. The Rebbe took young people, because they had to last for many, many years. Label and us. I mean, Rabbi Rothstein passed away. Rabbi Rothstein was a big chassid, and unfortunately, Rabbi Rothstein passed away, the Rebbe didn't replace him. And he took care of the Rebbe's letters, because the Rebbe wanted to keep a copy of each one of his letters. I mean, the Rebbe wrote millions of letters, millions, maybe 10 million letters. It's impossible to understand how many letters the Rebbe wrote. I mean, half of them are the same bar mitzvah letter, the same chasna, but the Rebbe had to sign each one. And Rabbi Simpson kept a copy of every single letter, organized. He was very systematic, very organized. In the very, very beginning, he would work in the Rebbe's room. The Rebbe wouldn't let him leave his office. The Rebbe would do his work while the Rebbe was there. And Rabbi Simpson describes how sometimes the Rebbe would do interesting things and he would stop to look at the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, I'll do my work, you do yours. That's how the Rebbe was so concerned with secrecy. And he would push it work in the Rebbe's room. I don't know where the letters were stored. Then he moved to a closet. There's a little closet upstairs. Mamish, a closet, a hole in the wall, a walk-in closet on the first floor of 770. But after a while, so they finally got him an office. But he has the archive. He's now passed away. And the Rebbe was incredibly concerned with protecting people's privacy. And it was his job to make sure that nothing leaked. And nothing did leak. The Rebbe trusted him. Nothing leaked. The Rebbe trusted him. And he worked with the Rebbe on the letters all the years. All the years.
The father or the son? You said that
the son of Rabbi Eliyahu Simpson. He passed away 2 summers ago or last summer.
Okay.
Rabbi said, he buried his next. If you go to the oil, behind the oil, all the Rebbe secretaries are laying. He's there also. Rabbi Simpson. That was Rebbe's Maskiris. Later on, the Rebbe took Yudel Krinsky, and then later on, he took Rabbi Binyamin Klein. Binyamin Klein was actually yes, that's Rabbi Yudel Krinsky. And then later on, he took Rabbi Binyamin Klein, Allah Shalom. Binyamin Klein was actually hired to be Rabbi Chaderkov's secretary, but he really was a special man, and that was it. The Rebbe did not hire anybody after that. In other words, the Rebbe hired I really look at it that the Rebbe became a Rebbe, and he saw how long this has to last. He took dafke very young people because they had to grow with him, and the Rebbe didn't want to hire people in the middle. It seems like the idea of once the Rebbe takes off, He can't get what he needed. The Rebbe didn't hire anybody new, not in the 70s and not in the 80s, not in the late 60s. He just, whatever he had, and that was it. And all of these people, as the Rebbe became bigger, the work grew. The same people schlepping a bigger load. They worked day and night. They worked incredibly, incredibly hard. The maskinim of the Rebbe.
They all worked at the same time? This is all just, you're saying that all those Rebbe secretaries were all in the same place at the same exact time?
Of course. Yeah.
Doing different work.
They did different things, right?
What did Rabbi Klein do?
Rabbi Klein did the same things Rabbi Groner did. But Rabbi Klein had a very, very special... Rabbi Klein was a very special man. He was a very special man. I think the thing that's most distinctive about his job was that because he was an Israeli and his personality, that he was so quiet and so smart, he really became the Rebbe's person towards the Israeli government and politicians and the press. He was very close to very, very important people in Eretz Yisrael who over the years gained an incredible amount of respect for the Rebbe. He was the medium between them and the Rebbe and them. This was an incredibly serious job, and it required, of course, incredible secrecy. This, of course, is in addition to his regular role as a maskir, as a meshoris, and so on. He was especially nice, extraordinarily nice. The pressure that he carried was not normal. Rabbi Klein was very smart. He never forgot anything. He never forgot anything. I know for a fact, from a relative of mine. Someone in my family had a certain illness. And they wrote to the Rebbe about it. So Rabbi Klein said, I know another chassid who had a similar illness. Go speak to those people. Maybe they can give you directions to doctors. So they went to those people, and they started asking questions, and they didn't remember. Rabbi Klein remembered the doctors' names better than the family did. He knew everybody's phone number on his head. He had an incredible memory. And he never said a word. Not a word. Nothing came out of his mouth. Rabbi Klein said, and Rabbi Krinsky said the same thing, that when they were hired, Rabbi Chadakov said to both of them, Ich kann dir nicht sagen, nicht zu sehen. I can't tell you that you shouldn't see. I'm not asking what with your eyes closed. Aber du touchst nicht erzählen. What happens in this room stays here. And when you work with the Rebbe, you are not allowed to repeat anything. In other words, even if you thought something was not a big deal, it may have been a very big deal, I'll tell you, I have a Yid who I davened with, his name is Schoenberg Gardetsky. So his father was Benjamin Gardetsky. Benjamin Gardetsky was almost as close to the Rebbe as Chadakov. Benjamin Gardetsky was the traveling secretary. He was very important to the Rebbe. Every time he traveled, and he traveled Nachanant, when he would come back from a trip, he'd have a 4-hour yechidus. Before he left on a trip, he'd have another 4 hours. And there's this famous film that got out a couple of years ago. They were sitting in shul after Yechidus closed, talking to Rabbi Gardetsky. They just talked for hours. When he had a stroke, the Rebbe told his son that he should come with his father. And he told him, from today on, not a word that you hear is repeated. And he was thinking, what's the big deal? But then he went into the Rebbe. The Rebbe used to talk about people. The Rebbe would schmooze with him, would gossip with him for hours. The Rebbe wanted to know what's going on in every country, in every community. And the Rebbe would talk. When you met the Rebbe on that level, that's what he told me. Now I understood what it means not to repeat. Because you couldn't even imagine how consequentially words were. The Rebbe would say opinions about people. I like this guy, I don't like this guy. This guy's cheap, this guy's smart, this guy's lazy. The conversations were so intimate. They were really conversations of co-workers. And the Rebbe didn't talk to a lot of people that way. But the people he did talk that way, the conversations were very frank. And they were not allowed to say a word. Rabbi Chadakov took to his grave secrets that could burn the world to pieces. He never opened his mouth. That was his job. And the Rebbe took the kind of people who knew how to keep secrets. He took those kinds of people. And the maskirs that the Rebbe worked. 40 years, how did I say it in America? No leaks. No leaks. What needed to be kept secret, as far as the Rebbe was concerned. If you leaked once, you were out of a job. You didn't get 2 chances. If you worked in the Rebbe's secretary and you opened your mouth, you were fired the same day. Finished. You were not allowed to say a word. Even if it was, the Rebbe ate breakfast at 11:15. Nothing that I read in a Sefer, that the Rebbe Rashab had a secretary, who every Shabbos morning at 7 o'clock would bring the Rebbe a cup of tea. At 10 to 8, he'd walk out of the Rebbe's room with the empty glass of tea. A little bit of tea was left over. And the Bacher was standing outside the Rebbe's room, and they would say, the Rebbe getrunken tea? The Rebbe drank tea? He would say, ich weiß nicht. I don't know. And it wasn't a lie. I mean, he brought the whole cup. He took out an empty cup, but he didn't see if they ever drank it to fed it to a cat. But that's how secretaries operate. I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know anything. That was the job if you wanted to work with the Rebbe. Anyway, so the next morning, the Rebbe shows up in 770, and with a smile on his face, he says to this collection of Chevre, let's go over the names again. There was Rabbi Rothstein, Olav Hashem, there was Rabbi Chadakov, there was Mindel, Nissen Mindel, there was Label Groner, and Rabbi Quint. And he says, Nu, Medaf Machal and Ayin Blanc, we've got to make a new stationery. Because until then, the Rebbe had been using, when he wrote letters, he used the stationery of Machane and Merkez. The Rebbe had stationery as the head of the different organizations of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And during that interim year, all of the letters that he wrote, which were really letters written by a Rebbe, didn't have his stationery on it. So the secretary said to the Rebbe, okay, so what do you want to write? This is classic Rebbe. So the Rebbe said, no, you write up a draft and I'll fix it. So the way I understood from Label, the person with the chush was Rothstein, Moshe Leib. He was a Chassidish Yid. So he took the Frierdiker Rebbe station and just changed the name. Grand Rabbi of Lubavitch, however it was spelled. Rabbi, the Frierdiker Rebbe is to write in English, Joseph Isaac. So they took the same station of the Rebbe, and they wrote, Kleit, Kedushas, Admor, they made it very beautiful. The same stationery as the Frierdiker Rebbe, they brought it into the Rebbe. And when the Rebbe was done with it, it was like there was nothing. There's no grand, there's no rabbi. The Rebbe, it says Rabbi Harav, the Rebbe's first name Shneis, that's all it says. And underneath it says 770, business address, 770, it said business address, 770 Eastern, 770, business phone number, highest 9250. Rabbi Rothstein was very disturbed that the Rebbe wrote on his stationery, business phone. The idea that there's hours. And I heard that one of the old Hasidim came to 770, he saw the Rebbe going home at night, and he asked, when is the Rebbe coming back? And they told him in the morning, and he asked, if you need the Rebbe during the night, can you get to the Rebbe? They said, no, he started to cry. He says, in Lubavitch, there was no such thing as night. There was no such thing as, there was no 24 hours a day. The day the Rebbe went home, and the Rebbe put on the station a business phone, Rabbi Rothstein, it was like a bone in his throat. And a few years he worked with the Rebbe on this. He pushed, the Rebbe finally, they removed the words business phone. But the stationery was so simple. There was nothing. There was name and address, and that was it. There was no grand rabbi, all those titles. The Rebbe argued with them. The Rebbe didn't want to put the word Lubavitch on the stationery. So he said to the Rebbe, you're the Lubavitch Rebbe. He says, but I'm not mi Lubavitch. I never stepped foot in Lubavitch. It's a lie. So he told the Rebbe, whether you were in Lubavitch, not Lubavitch, you represent Lubavitch. He said, but I wasn't there. So the concession was that instead of saying mi Lubavitch, it says Lubavitch. The Rebbe's letters, the Rebbe's stationery letterhead doesn't say from Lubavitch, it says Lubavitch. Those are the kind of things that they were busy with. Anyway, but that's what happened. That's what happened. The Rebbe became a Rebbe. New situation. I once heard that Rabbi Rothstein made policies about how the Maskirim should behave in a way that was considered respectable and was based on a certain kind of tradition. And the Rebbe became a Rebbe. And things started happening. The Rebbe involved himself with Anash all over the world. And in the beginning, things happen slowly. You ask people who are around and they'll tell you that the first big project of the Rebbe was to create a community. There was no community. The Lubavitchers were broken. And the Rebbe was involved with the generation, not my parents' generation, my grandfather's generation, like a father. And then those children grew up. And it took a while for those children to grow up. The kids who grew up around the Rebbe, they were the first soldiers. They were the shluchim. That's how the Rebbe built Lubavitch. And in the beginning, he was so intimately involved in everybody's life. It was extraordinary. Now, some of the stories that happened in conjunction with the Rebbe's Kabolas and Hanesius is this. Number one, Purim. Purim was a Fabrengen. And the Chassidim came. I don't know how many Chassidim were there, but it wasn't 1,000, it probably wasn't even 100. And the Rebbe took a lot of mashke. And a lot of the Chassidim took a lot of mashke. There is a tape of a part of that Fabrengen, not the whole Fabrengen. And towards the end of the Fabrengen, the Rebbe became very emotional. And the Rebbe turned to the Chassidim who were there, the elder Chassidim, and he said to them, that I'm impressed with your moichin, with your great mind, that you saw the Rebbe Rashab in Lubavitch. You saw the Friedrich Rebbe, the Rebbe de Shver. And now you have Mem Shin, And it says, it's a Größkeit von Naya Zeit, was ihr weht nicht. It's a greatness on your part that you're not crying. The first Purim was a month after Kabolas Hanesius. And those old people were not crying, they were dancing. They were so happy to have the Rebbe. So and he said that the Gemara says that when they built the second Beis HaMikdash, all the people who saw the first Beis HaMikdash were crying. The putting of the Beis HaMikdash, they're crying because they knew what the first Beis HaMikdash looked like, and they knew that this is not the same thing. So Rabbi Simpson said to the Rebbe, Chassidim kennen das nicht hören. Chassidim can't hear this. Rabbi Mentlik was a beautiful Jew. He was so fine. He was such an Edel Yid, and he was such a strong mind, and such a strong chassid. He was a moidendike makusher. And Rabbi Mentlik was also shekir, took a lot of mashke. Rabbi Mentlik is described as the statue who stood to the Rebbe's right and didn't budge. He would stand by Fabrengen like this. Didn't move a muscle. Didn't move a muscle. The whole time. 5, 6, 7, didn't move a muscle. The Rebbe once got the manga shaken. The Rebbe gave him to drink mashke. He was shaken out of his mind. He stood like this, didn't budge. The Rebbe walked out, he pushed it chalished. But he's such bittul. He was such a chassid. The Mentik was a big lamb. He was a gon. He was a baki b'shas. But he was so bottled to the Rebbe. And Rabbi Mentlik said, it's not true. He said, befedish nicht azay. It's one chain from the Alter Rebbe. And he got up from his place and went over to the Rebbe. He said, I want to take mashke from the Alter Rebbe. And the Rebbe gave him. And there's a word that they say attached to it, that he said to the Rebbe something about it's one chain from the Alter Rebbe. So the Rebbe said it depends on some Kabbalistic idea whether it's a chain or it's not a chain, but there was some oisius around this story. But the point is, the Rebbe made a comment. Motel, Rabbi Mentik's name was Motel. Motel is also so bezbash as if a Motel should say to the Rebbe such words, there have to be a lot of mashke in him. So that was a memorable Purim that happened at that time. And then of course Yud Nissen, the first game of letters to the Rebbe went to the oil. And in the Yom on Yud Nissen, the Rebbe put in the entry about Yom Ledes. So the Rebbe sent a label Groner into the Zal. It was a Bacharel. And he said to the Rabbi Groner, to tell the Bacharim, as oib sie seinen Gerät sich übergeben mit Anemes, sollen sie unschreiben Mishmon B'Shem Imam. If they're prepared to give themselves over mit Anemes, they should write down their names and their mother's names. And he said, "Me vet nishmonen gedeles und etzuris, aber man soll wissen, dass es nicht kein joke. I'm not going to demand from you to do crazy things, but it's not a joke." So he went into the Beis HaMedrash, told the Bacham that the Rebbe said, if you're prepared to be the Rebbe's Amensh, to do what the Rebbe wants, sign your name, but and understand that you're committing to something real. So they all signed their name. This was another event that happened in the beginning of the Rebbe's Kabolas Hanesius. From a lot of parts of the world, there was congratulations. From a lot of places, there was an understanding that the Rebbe becoming Rebbe was significant. It was a big deal. Chocha Filu Lubavitch was so small, Lubavitch was so broken, and from all sides there were mazel tovs. There was congratulations. The Rebbe became Rebbe. One of the interesting stories, it didn't happen then, but it happened a very short while after, is the story with the Rebbe's 50th birthday. Yud Nissen the following year. The Rebbe turned 50. The Rebbe did not fabring on Yud Nissen. The Rebbe did not fabring Yud Nissen until he turned 16, then until he turned 69. So, when the Rebbe turned 50, he didn't make a fabrengen, but he invited the elder Chassidim into his room for a maimah. The Rebbe said a maimah in his cheder. And he also said to bring in some of the Bachrim. Rabbi Elkan was there, Rabbi David Raskin was always lying there, were invited in. The elder Bach, the Rebbe chose who should come into his room. And the Rebbe said, a maimah Hashem's fasai tiftach. And the Rebbe cried terribly into the maimah. He cried terribly. One of the people who was there was Reb Shmuel Levitin. Reb Shmuel Levitin was almost the same age as the Friedrich Rebbe. Reb Shmuel Levitin was a very, very smart giant of a Jew. He really was a giant. And he was very instrumental in making the Rebbe. People felt that maybe he didn't consider himself enough of a chassid of the Rebbe, but he for sure was one of the most important players, maybe the most important player in making sure the Rebbe became a Rebbe. And the Rebbe had a unique relationship with Reb Shmuel. The Rebbe used to chat with Reb Shmuel. He would talk to Shmuel the way he didn't talk to anybody else. The Rebbe went to weddings. They went to Menachem Avol. Shmuel went along, and they would talk in the car, from the car to the car. So the Rebbe was so emotional. So when the Rebbe finished the Maimer, Rebbe Shmuel said to the Rebbe, Tashmieni Sasen V'Simcha. The Rebbe turned 50. So it's saying Kapitel Nun Aleph. It will be saved by Krish Mishalamita. And in that Kapitel, it's David HaMelech's Tshuva Kapitel, for those of you who learn Tanya with me. So on the one hand, there's very great bitterness. On the other hand, there's very great joy. So he said to the Rebbe, Tashmieni Sasen V'Simcha. Your person has to be freilich. So the Rebbe taught it with the second half of the pasuk. Tagelna Atzama is the Kisa. You take bones, Atzomis, the Kisa, you crush them, and you tell them to get them. In other words, I appreciate the sentiment, but from where I'm sitting, it's not so much fun. You know what I'm saying?
Why didn't do it for bringing when he turned 50?
I'm sorry.
Why didn't he do it for bringing when he turned 50?
Oh, I knew what the Rebbe does. I don't know. Yeah, but that's the Rebbe's minhag. The Rebbe introduced all those minhagim. So of course the story goes that there were a lot of things that the Rebbe did by the Friedrich Rebbe. So people thought they're going to do the same shtick with the Rebbe. L'moshel. The Rebbe was in France in 1947. And he asked the Chassidim who were there, why are they coming to America? So they told the Rebbe, because everybody who asks the Friedrich Rebbe where to go, the Friedrich Rebbe tells them to go to Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe said, you're making a mistake. Don't ask the Friedrich Rebbe where you should go. Tell the Friedrich Rebbe you're coming to America and ask for a brach. The Rebbe gave them this advice, the Rebbe. So some people did that. They wrote a letter to the Friedrich Rebbe, they commented, and they gave a brach. When the Rebbe became Rebbe, they continued to do that trick. And they got back an immediate, excuse me, who told you to come to America? First you have to ask where to go, and then we'll give you brachas. So he told the Rebbe, this is your trick. It was your idea that we should tell you we're coming to America. So the Rebbe said, it's der Zetnin mit andere Spakulen. Now I'm wearing different glasses. The Rebbe did not approve of suggestions he himself made once he was the one sitting on the chair. When it was the Friedrich Rebbe, the Rebbe was the Eidim, he was the Chassid. Now, and the Rebbe said to people, now I see things different and the answers are different. I mean, one of the stories that they tell, and I believe it's a true story, was that the Rebbe complained that there's no money in Lubavitch. And all the money they got was fremde Geld, from Freie Yidden. It was very embarrassing. So the Rebbe got together a million of Chassidim. Got a million of Chassidim. And he said to them, let's go to the Friedrich Rebbe, and we'll demand that the Friedrich Rebbe should give a bracha as tzivishon anash, so sein gewinnen, that amongst Lubavitch should be rich Chassidim, and won't be dependent upon other people for the Rebbe's Hitzah, Pashut. Anyway, the Friedrich Rebbe passed away without them doing it. So that minion walked into the Rebbe a year later, and asked the Rebbe a bracha, that there should be gewinnen amongst anash, and the Rebbe should have money. And the Rebbe said, what? You know what kind of responsibility? He said, this is your idea. So the Rebbe said, it's the Zetman mit andere Spakulen. This is one of the stories that happened at that time. And of course, then there's the famous stories. I mean, now it's already public, where people came to Grand Heights to see the Rebbe. There's a lot of stories like this. It didn't happen once, but one of the stories was that the Rebbe was walking Eastern Parkway. Now the Rebbe looked gorgeous. I mean, if you looked at the Rebbe, you said, this is not a man, this is an angel. But he looked so youthful. And he walked, so there was nothing old about him. Everything was so vigorous, so youthful, so energetic. And the guy gets out of the train, and he says, Wie wohnt der Lubavitcher Rebbe? A Hungarian Jew from Williamsburg. Where's the Lubavitcher Rebbe live? So the guy tells him, was after the Lubavitcher Rebbe? He says, was heißt, ich kim verbruche. He says, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, hat gelernt in college. Is modern. So this guy screams at him, Scheigatz! He tells him, Scheigatz! Was verstehst du in Rebbes? What do you know about Rebbes? Anyway, he walks into the Rebbe and he discovered that he called the Rebbe a Shegitz, verstehst? Shaigatz. The Rebbe asked him, was modern? He went to college. And he walked into the Rebbe and he discovered that it was the Rebbe that he called a Shegitz. Shaigatz. Was verstehst du in Rebbes? This happened more than once or twice.
The Rebbe told that to him.
The Rebbe said to him, why the Lubavitcher Rebbe is a modern Rebbe? Why is the Lubavitcher Rebbe? There's a lot of stories with the Satmarov. The Satmarov was a giant of a man. He was very decisive, he was very strong, he was a great leader, but some issues, he was much older than the Rebbe. Satmarov was closer to the age of the Friedrich than the Rebbe. he would say, I don't know, go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It happened many times. The Chassidim from Satmar and Amol knew that when the Satmar Rebbe knew that this is above his pay grade, he had milchamas with the Rebbe, wars. But when it came above his pay, he would say, send to the Rebbe. And one of the stories, of course, was that this story was revealed after Gimel Tammuz, that Satmar Yid had no children. And he came to the Satmar Rav, asking for bracha for children, so Satmar Rav gave him a bracha. So by them, if on Chitzpeh, so he told the Satmar Rebbe, ich will nicht a bruch, ich will a haftuche. I don't want a brach, I want a promise. So the Satmar Rebbe said, haftuche kann ich dich nicht geben. I can't give you a promise. Auf Eastern Parkway dreht sich ein junger man. And Eastern Parkway wanders a young man. You can go to him. So he came to the Rebbe. He went into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was very happy to see him. There was very makadev. Bechlal, there was makadev everybody. Very makadev everybody. There was makadev everybody. And the Rebbe asked him, what's Herzach and Satmar? So he's telling him how the community is running. Lately there was a Simchas. He says, yeah, there was Siyam Mesechta, and Mesechta Chagig, I think, and the Satmar Rebbe spoke. What was the Teichen of the Drasha? That the Mesechta finishes that Poisha Yisrael Malaya Mitzvahs Kerimin. Sinners amongst the Jews are full of mitzvahs like panagrads. So the Satmar Rebbe asked, how could you say about a Jew who's a sinner that he's full of mitzvahs? So the Rebbe went into a trance. He said, "Chab dezelbe kasha. Wie kem sagen of eine was full with mitzvahs as a Pesach Yisrael." He turned it around. How can you say a Jew is full of mitzvahs as a Pesach Yisrael? The Rebbe gave him a bracha. The guy had 8 kids. 8 kids. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8. He told the story to the Lubavitchers. And there was these things in the early years where people didn't know who the Rebbe was. And they would help people across the street. He would help them carry their bags. And they would find out later that it was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Because he was so not shtikish. You know, the Rebbe used to walk home himself at night. Or at Chadakov, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, walk the streets himself. He had no entourage. And he walked without an umbrella. He would, the Rebbe did everything himself. And it was very impressive because that's not how most Rebbes operated. It was very tzniistic, very unbelievably efficient. The Rebbe didn't waste a second of his time. But anything he do for himself, he did by himself. That's how the Rebbe's Nesias started. And if you ask people who are around that generation, they'll tell you. My aunt, she's older than my father a few years, and there was such an optimism. When the Rebbe became a Rebbe, the feeling amongst the young Lubavitchers is we can do anything. The Rebbe made them feel so strong and so positive and so almost dreamy. The future is so bright because he himself had such an energy. And the young people, I told you, Rabbi Rothstein wrote a letter to somebody. The young kids are running around the Rebbe like flies. There was a magnetism. The Rebbe had such a magnetism. There was just such a love. Yisrael Gordon describes going to be Menachem Avil, some Rebbe, in Williamsburg or Borough Park, and they all went. The Rebbe came in, and the Rebbe sat down, they started to talk, and they were listening to the Rebbe talk, and this other Rebbe talk, and they were thinking to themselves, boy, do we got it good. Our Rebbe, there was such a pride. Such a pride. They tell a story. The Rebbe went to Williamsburg to be Menachem of the Satmar Rebbe, and then when he walked out, all the Chassidim lined up to give the Rebbe Shalom. And the Rebbe said to label, if I don't get out of here, he's going to be left without any Chassidim. I mean, that was the Mahus, the Fanem of the Rebbe. And there's no way in a million years you could have imagined that this little operation would become what it is. And it's just the Rebbe's Emunah. Just the Rebbe's Emunah. They were just the Friedrich Rebbe, they were 7th generation, finished, 7th generation Mashiach. So if that's what if the mathematics says you're supposed to bring Mashiach, you're going to bring Mashiach. I don't have the parts. I don't have anything. This is the math. Teila's emes. So you have to make it work. And that's the Rebbe for you. The Rebbe became Rebbe. Ibiket Lubavitch, Mamish. And in the Rebbe's personality, you have Malchus. On the one hand, there was never a more humble Rebbe. The Rebbe made nothing of himself. Nothing of himself. He wore a hat down. There was no streimel. There was nothing. On the other hand, the Rebbe was a king. The Rebbe was so strong and so aloof. You know, one of the things that nobody could figure out, no Rebbe sat by a table by himself. Look at pictures of the Friedrich of his Fabregens. People sat next to him. The Rebbe sat by the table, and next to him is no one. He's a one-man show. The contradictions of the Rebbe, on the one hand, there was really a deep humility. On the other hand, there was such a goin. The Rebbe knew that he I'm in charge and nobody's helping me. There's actually tapes for various reasons, for various occasions. We can actually hear the Rebbe telling people, you want to finish the Rebbe's job. In other words, you're giving me advice, how I should do my job. And they tell stories about how the Rebbe was impossible to help. I heard from my brother, who heard from an elder chassid, that when the Rebbe first became Rebbe, every one of the elder chassidim got a message. I'm Rebbe. How? L'mashal. This is an example. A guy was sitting behind the Rebbe with his hands like this. You're not supposed to do this. They do this only in a church. And the Rebbe has his back to him. And also the Rebbe turns around and makes his hands like this. Now the Rebbe saw without seeing. Every old chassid was given a message. I'm young and I look younger, but I'm tzarske mishpacha. This is it. I'm the Rebbe. And it was hard for them. They were older than the Rebbe, and the Rebbe so didn't fit the bill of an old Russian Rebbe. There was nothing old and nothing Russian about him. Everything was American, breit, freilach, optimistic. It was hard. And the Rebbe would take advice from no one. Again, this is a conversation two chassidim had once on a Matzah Yom Tov. The Rebbe sat from 8 to 3 o'clock in the morning. And then was Keshe Baruch at 6 o'clock in the morning. That was after 2 days of whatever it was. So one chassid, the other chassid, he's unstoppable. So the other chassid said to the first chassid these words. Bei jenem Rebbe hat sich allemal gemacht der Chuspenik, was die kennt sagen dem Rebbe mal Wort. By the previous Rebbe, there was always one Chuspenik who could say something to the Rebbe about watching his health, about shortening his day. Is fire. He's fire. If you ever suggested to the Rebbe anything, you ate it. You got it back with salt and pepper and cream. The Rebbe did not ask anybody advice about anything. And it became very clear early on, this is a one-man show. The Rebbe said, if I'm not sure what to do, I asked the Frierdiker Rebbe. But that's it. The Rebbe was really, there was a malchus about the Rebbe. The Rebbe didn't want anybody to think that they were going to give him advice and help him do his job, The Rebbe's Medina. She had a habit. When she wanted to tell you something and wanted to make sure she meant business, she would take you into her husband's office. The Frierdiker's room was sitting there, and she had these moods. She called 3 chassidim and she schlepped them into the Frierdiker's room, which meant that over here you better do what I say because the authority of the person who sits in this chair. Yeah? And she said, I was by the Shver, by the Rebbe Rashab. I was by the Man, by Frierdiker Rebbe, and there was never a Rebbe who sat till 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 nights a week and talked to people. They all had yechidus, but had limited hours. The way the Rebbeim had yechidus was, let's say it was from 9 to 12. If you came to have yechidus and it came 12 o'clock, you went home. The Rebbe had yechidus until the list ran out. You put your name on a list, and every person on that list used to go into the Rebbe that day.
But you said Rabbi Rothstein was saying about the hours. He was upset about the business hours.
No, the business.
That it was written on the stationary business phone.
No, but that the Rebbe went home at night.
It's not a contradiction. It was going like 6 o'clock. They would go home at 7 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning. He went home, but when he went home, so she said to them, the Rebbe used to sit a whole night. I heard that there were years that the secretary would leave. There was a list. And Rabbi Grona stuck around, Rabbi Krinsky stuck around, Chadakov always waited. Chadakov didn't go home for the Rebbe. Chadakov sat in his office and you would walk into him and he was his eyes were turning, he was exhausted. Chadakov wasn't a Rebbe, he was a butler of a dub. He wouldn't leave till the Rebbe left. And after all of Yechidus was over, Rabbi Chadakov went into the Rebbe with the last collection of mail and notes, and then they went home together. They went together. Chadakov and Rebbe used to walk home together, and later they drove home together. They went home together every night. But there were years that the list of the Yechidus would be handed from person to person. There were 30 names on a list in an order, so you gave it to the person after you. When you went into the Rebbe, you handed it was like a baton. And the Rebbe sat whole nights, 3 nights a week. Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday was Yechidus. And then by around 1964, it became only Sunday and Thursday. But ganze Nacht. And she said to them, there was never such a thing. A Rebbe should sit all night. It's not good for his health. You have to stop him. Well, they didn't even try. They were afraid of him. The Rebbe established such power They were pashut, afraid of him. They were pashut, afraid of him. Years later, there's a story that Leibel Shapiro tells that they were worried about the Rebbe's health. So they had a meeting, and they asked for a yechidus with the Rebbe. And they went into the Rebbe's room, a group of people, rather than telling him what to do in public. And the spokesperson was Harav Talushkin, Nissen Talushkin. He was an old Lubavitcher Rav. And they were so afraid, they had no idea what was going to react. The Rebbe was very nice to them, and he listened to them, and he heard them out. And they complained that the Rebbe goes to the oil too much, they complained that the Rebbe fabrengs too much, and they complained that the Rebbe has yechidus too much. And the Rebbe said, okay, I'll fabreng less, I'll fabreng shorter. But again, to going to the oil, he said, oh no, oil has to be. You want answers? There has to be oil. One of the people in that room was an old chassid by the name of Rebbe Zalman Duchman, Alav Hashem. Rebbe Zalman Duchman used to go to the Frierdiker Rebbe's oil all the time. So he told them, the oil is not bad, it's nice, ask Zalman, it's wonderful. It could be 20 degrees below zero, it could be 100, but ask Zalman, Rebbe Zalman. I get chasach for the oil, it's nice and comfortable. But that one occasion, they were shocked how the Rebbe listened to them. And then maybe some say, Pasha did it respectfully. They didn't just go over to him and tell him, excuse me, I saw a film, Jem gave it out. Harav Yalis had written the Rebbe a letter in the early 1970s that the Rebbe should sleep more. So when he wrote the Rebbe this letter, the Rebbe gave him an immediate answer. But the answer the Rebbe gave him was a whole pilpul, how many hours a night a person has to sleep. And the way the Rebbe answered him, it was mashma that the Rebbe was answering his question, how much he should sleep. The Rebbe just ignored the fact. Anyway, by the Fabrengen, he went over to the Rebbe again, Rabbi Yolis. He sat next to the Rebbe, actually, at the table, but a few feet away. And he said, I'm apologizing for what I wrote to the Rebbe, and I hope the Rebbe's not upset. The Rebbe said, why should I be upset? If I would have been upset, I wouldn't have answered. I answered you right away. And then the Rebbe says, I wrote that people can sleep 8 hours, or 6 hours, or 4 hours. Are you able to go with so little sleep? The Rebbe is telling Rabbi Yolis. Rabbi Yolis says, but the Rebbe darf schlufen. I didn't write about me, I read about you. So he says, ich schlaf asach. I sleep a lot. 2 hours a night. Gil Hirsch is my neighbor. He told me that Rabban Klein, Olav Hashem, he was a special, he used to bring the Rebbetzin flowers, roses. And he had a florist. So one day he comes back into the store. He says, I just went to the Rebbetzin. I brought her flowers and she told me something. So you're the last person I saw. So I'm coming to tell you what she said. She says, Ich weiß nicht, was tun mit dem Mann. Schläft 2 Stunden a Nacht. It's 2 hours a night. 1 hour he sleeps sitting on the chair, and 1 hour he lays down. I heard that the Rebbetzin said the Rebbe couldn't sleep, partially because he was worrying about people. The Rebbe would stay awake at night if he knew the people were not well. He was worried, physically worried about people. Individual people. You understand? Okay, I'll see you after Shabbos.